Hello and welcome to another video. Now today what we're going to be looking at is a new idea here, which is how to get daily data from a website, and we're going to save it locally in a folder, and this will all be done automatically. Now in order to do this we're going to use three different technologies, the first of which is going to be Power Query, and we'll use that from Excel to actually go to the website and get the latest version of the data. And then we're going to use VBA to then take that data, put it into a CSV file and save it in a certain folder. And the last thing we're going to look at is the task scheduler in Windows to see how we can set this up so that it can run automatically at a specified time every day. Now this does require having your computer turned on, or at least in sleep mode. And what you can do, there's an option to set it to automatically wake your computer and log in with a specified user ID and password at a certain time every day in order to do this. Now what we've done is a couple of clever things there, and a couple of things that you need to be aware of. One of them is the Power Query. We need to set something different on the refresh options, so we need to set it so that it doesn't do a background refresh. Now the reason for that is because in the VBA code this is going to be set to run automatically as soon as the file opens, and a part of the VBA will be doing the refresh. And what we don't want is we don't want the VBA to continue through the lines of code before the Power Query refresh has finished. So we've got to set it so that the Power Query refresh is not running in the background with other operations, and the VBA steps will wait until the previous step is completed before it continues. And finally, our task scheduler, we need to make sure we've saved the file in a place that we've got access to, and I'll take you through some of the settings in the task scheduler. Because the file runs the VBA automatically on opening, the task scheduler just simply has to open the file and the VBA will do the rest. So let's have a look at the actual file. So this is another Excel file that I've got here, and it's got a start sheet, and on the start sheet I've simply got a formula in there which says equals today. Now if I go into the cell you'll see what that is. So the equals today returns today's date based on whatever the date is in your right hand corner of your screen. Now the data that we're going to get is actually not today's date but yesterday's date. Now so to understand this, let's have a look at the website that we're going to get the data from. Now of course the topical thing at the moment is COVID, so we're going to be getting some COVID data, and you'll see that this website is called worldometers.info/coronavirus. There is no date component to the web address. And on the website there are a variety of component parts that we could interrogate using Power Query. And in fact there are three of them, but we can only see one at a time. And these are the three tables. Now today's data, again, that doesn't have a date component. It's just assuming that today is the latest version. You'll notice this would be useless to us because at any time of day it's going to be incomplete. It's only complete at the very end of that day, and at that point it immediately becomes yesterday's data. So that's what we're going to be doing. We're going to actually be looking at the yesterday data, which is fully completed because obviously that day is now finished. So this is the table that we're going to get. We're not going to get the first table, we're going to get the second table. The third table would be irrelevant to us, we're not interested in that. We want to get yesterday's data, but because of that we need to tag it with yesterday's date. So what I have in here is another formula that says whatever today's date is -1, and that will give me yesterday's date. Now, the actual Power Query itself, let's have a look at this. So if we go into Queries and Connections, I'm going to go into my query. Now the first thing I've got a query for is this date here. I simply got that data from this table, and if I go into the query itself, we'll be able to see when it comes up and lets me bring it on the screen. Okay, we'll be able to see that the result of the query is the date that was in that table. So it just goes to current workbook, gets the table, which I haven't named correctly, it's just called table 2, and it simply changes it into a date. Now I had to change that manually because by default it changed it into a date time, and I specifically want it just to be a date. And you'll notice later on in the VBA, I don't use this date in the VBA. This date is only used for the next query. Now the next query is the one that goes to get the actual data. So let's start at the source again, and this goes to that web page, and it's simply got the web address, and like I said, there's no date component in there. Now on that web address there are 3 different tables, so we have to choose which one we want, and that would be the main table countries yesterday table. Now we'd actually do that with the dialog when we're setting it up. So we say get data from website, we type in the web address, and then our navigation will come up and it will ask us within this which of the tables do we want, or we'd have chosen not the first one but the second one. Now when you're actually setting this up, you'll get a preview screen on the right hand side, so you can actually see a preview of that table as you're doing it. We then have a changed type step, which is sorting some data and changing the type. And here's where I'm adding a custom column. Now the custom column that I'm adding is going to have the date. So my custom column, I'm going to name it date, and it's putting in data date as the variable. Now that will fill in the data date, which is yesterday's date, in every row in that new column. So I then expand the date, and if I move across to the right hand side you'll be able to see how it works. So before it was expanded, it wouldn't have come in as a date, it would have come in just as a table. So if I go back there, you see how it's showing as a table, and what you then need to do is hit the expand button, and when you've expanded it, it shows that then as a separate column. I'm now reordering the column so that that one goes right back to the beginning, just so it's easier for me to access. And it doesn't matter, but what I could do here is I could make sure that that is now specified as a date type. Okay, if I then close and load, this is going to load into my daily data worksheet, and it's going to load it in as a table. Now that's important that it's loaded onto the sheet, because when we come to looking at the VBA, what the VBA is going to do is it's going to change to that sheet and then save it as a CSV. That will then take all of the data that's in that sheet and just save it as a single CSV file in a specified location. And part of the VBA is going to say, look for the location that this file is saved in, and save the CSV in the same location. And it's also going to say take this date here, well in fact it's not, it's going to say take today's date -1, but that will be in the VBA code rather than referring to the cell. So take today's date -1 and put that in as a component part of the file name, so that in the folder where all the files are saved, there'll be a separate file for each day. And if you run the code twice on the same day, all it will do is overwrite the existing file. Okay, so that's the first part, which is the Power Query. Now the one thing that I haven't mentioned yet, looking at the Power Query, is this query here is one that will have a refresh schedule. This one here does not have a refresh schedule because it's just automatically loaded up. But if I right click on here and say properties, we must turn off the background refresh. That will be enabled by default. This has to be turned off, otherwise the VBA code is going to try to run through the next step whilst it's still trying to refresh. So that would cause the file to save before it's actually finished refreshing with today's data. So there's a very good chance you'll end up with mostly yesterday's data in this file, which wouldn't be good. Okay, let's now have a look at the VBA itself. So the VBA that's going to run here, and you might be confused by this because you look at it and you say, well, there's my daily COVID data file, which is what that one is, and there is no VBA because there are no modules. But this is not VBA that's stored in a module. This is an event-driven VBA, and it's stored on the workbook. And because it's stored on the workbook, it has an open event that triggers it. So as soon as the file is opened, which will happen through the task scheduler, as soon as the file is opened, it will run automatically. Let's go through the code and see what it does. So the first part of the code simply turns off the screen updating, and this will stop the every action in the VBA being shown in the Excel. The first actual step is to run something called calculate. Now that's just the same as going into Excel and going to the formulas ribbon and telling the Excel to do a calculate now. So if you go to formulas and go across here and say calculate now or calculate sheet, in this instance I would do calculate now, and that will calculate the entire workbook and all the formulas on that workbook. Why is that necessary? Well, here we have a formula which says get today's date. I want that to have updated before my VBA runs. So that will at least have looked down here to got today's date, and this one here, I also want this one to have calculated to work out yesterday's date. So those are the two that we need the calculate to do. Then we go down here and we say on this active workbook we've got a connection, and the connection is to this query daily COVID data, which is the query on the workbook, and clearly I want to refresh that query. Now if I go back into the workbook, we'll see that's this query here is set to refresh. And now that there, because I've turned off the background refresh option, it will have to finish doing that before it does the next step in the VBA. That's very important. If you don't do that, the code will immediately go on to the next line and the next line and the next line without pausing before it's done the refresh. Now this might seem weird, as my next step is a refresh all. You might say, well, I've just refreshed the necessary thing, why do I need to do a refresh all again? This is just an umbrella. This is just to catch everything. It's something that I generally put in my code just to be safe. You don't need it, but it's good practice to put it in. Now what else might need to be refreshed? Well, actually in the workbook I've got a table that needs to be refreshed, so my query should automatically update this table, but I want to make sure that that table and everything else in the workbook has fully refreshed before I go on to the next line of code. Now this query might even take 25 or 30 seconds to actually run the query. So here I am wasting another 25 or 30 seconds when all the time I'm going on about how to make your code more efficient and better. Do you know what? It doesn't matter, because this is going to be run automatically at 5 o'clock in the morning. It's going to turn my machine on, it's going to open Excel, it's going to run the code, it's going to save the file, it's going to close the files down. I don't care if that takes an extra 25 seconds because I'm still in bed asleep. So because it's automated, I don't mind the fact that it's going to take a little longer. I'd rather it was more robust and that it's guaranteed to have all the data refreshed properly rather than running that extra 25 seconds faster. Okay, the next one is making sure that we are on the right sheet before we save. Now if you know that a CSV file, when you save it, it only saves one sheet, and if I'm also still on this sheet, which I will be if the code is running because I'm starting on this sheet, if I'm still on the sheet, it's going to save just that data as my daily COVID data, which is not what I want. I want it to change to this sheet here and then save all of that as my daily COVID data CSV. Okay, the next one is telling it to actually what it needs to save it as. So I've got this variable file to save as, and I'm building that up with a path. Now the path is the same as this workbook path. In other words, wherever this Excel file is saved, that's the same path that I want to save my CSV. And I'm then joining that together with some text. Now it is important to put in the / because the path itself doesn't include the folder slash. So I'm now specifying that within this workbook path I want a subfolder which is called COVID Daily Data, and it's also joined together with today's date. So that is just simply date, and I'm saying date -1 because I actually want yesterday's date. And I've wrapped that all up in the command format, and I'm saying YYYYMMDD. Now why do I have to do that? Well, if I don't do that, what it'll do is it'll put in the date with the slashes. So it'll put in the day, month, year format, and by having the slashes in there, it will imply that it wants that saved as part of the path, and therefore it will automatically create a subfolder for the relevant parts of the date, which I don't want. I'll then join that together with the extension .csv. Now all of that is loaded into a variable called file to save as. We then do the actual save. So here I've got my active workbook save as. The file name is what I've just put in as that variable file to save as. Format, CSV, create backup. No, I don't need to create a backup. In other words, a copy of the file I'm working on. I then turn back on my screen updating, and I now say active window close. Now what that will do is it will shut down my Excel. Sometimes shuts down the Excel completely, sometimes doesn't. Sometimes it leaves the Excel open but with no files open. Either way is fine. It's easy enough for me to just shut Excel down. Okay, so that's the VBA. Now because that is set to run automatically on opening the file, we just need to be slightly careful. Every time we open this file, it's going to run the code, and part of the code is closing the file down. So when you want to come in here to edit something, what you need to do is open the file and immediately press escape. Escape will crash out of the code or step out of the code, and it'll do that during the refresh phase for the query, and you've got plenty of time to do that, so just press escape after you've opened the file. It will pause and you can then go in and edit things and make a change. And that's a useful tip every time you are working on a file that has code that runs automatically, if that code then shuts the file down when it's finished. Now the important thing about making it run automatically is the third technology we're going to have a look at. So the third technology is going to be my app scheduler or task scheduler. If I go into my Windows menu and just simply type in SCH, it comes up with the task scheduler, and we will now be able to see various different tasks we've got. And I've got get COVID data, and that's to run at 5 AM every day. If I double click there, it will open that up, and I've got various different things here that we do need to set. So when you're first creating this, you don't obviously have it set up in your library of ones that are running. What you do is you just simply go to the right hand side and say create task, and it will open this dialog, which everything will be empty. Now in here I've given it a name, and the author is me, and that's who I'm going to use as the user when running the task. Now you do need to make sure that this is set correctly. You may have to fiddle around with it, and you will probably have to store your password when you press OK. You'll have to put your password in again. It will store the password by default if you say to run whether the user is logged in or not, because it does need that password, because if another user is logged in, it needs to log this user in and run it, and it needs the password in order to do that. So I've set this to run whether the user is logged in or not. Running only when the user is logged in is the default. I've also set it to run with the highest privileges, which will then give me access to my OneDrive, which is where I've saved this file. I need to be able to be logged into my OneDrive as well, and I'm actually logged in with a different address to my OneDrive. So that's why I need the highest privileges. I need all of my logins to be available. I've also set it to configure for Windows 10. That's not the default. Windows XP 8, I think, is the default, or maybe XP 7. We now need to say what triggers this action. So the action is triggered by a schedule, which is daily every day. Now if I double click there, you'll see we have the options for setting the triggers. This is on a schedule. We could choose another action, another event, various other things as the trigger. On a schedule works perfectly here. I want this to run daily at 5 AM every day. Now I could say synchronize across time zones. If I'm going to be moving about, then I want it to always be at 5 o'clock on the time zone, or in the time zone when I started doing this, or when I set it up. And if my laptop moves to a different time zone and therefore my computer time changes, I still want it to run on GMT. Okay, I'm going to press OK on that one. The next option is the action. In other words, what do I want to happen for this task that I'm scheduling? I'm saying I want it to start a program. Now this is weird because I don't actually want it to start a program. I want it to open a file. But I've set it to start a program and I've gone to the file path. The default action for double clicking on that file is to open Excel and then open that file in Excel. Now I do have the option for that file to then say start in if I wanted to force it to open in a specific program. So I always wanted it to open in Excel, even if the default action for that file extension had changed, for example, to Chrome Sheets. I don't have to do that in this case because only I use this computer, so no one's going to change it from starting in Excel. I'm going to click OK. And the conditions I'm not going to worry about here. In fact, I am. There's a couple I'm going to change here. So by default it's set to stop if the computer switches to battery power. I've deselected that. And I have set it to wake the computer to run this task. In other words, if my computer is asleep, which it will be, it will automatically wake to run the task. You can set it to start only if the following network connection is available. You can choose a connection or leave it at any connection. I've unchecked that one, and the reason is because when my computer is asleep, it temporarily turns off the internet connection. So it would say, oh, wake up, and as soon as it wakes up, the internet connection hasn't become available, so it will not do it. I'm saying wait until the internet connection is available. Don't just start if it's already available, otherwise it will pause. Now here in the in the settings, what we can do is we can say make sure the task runs again or tries to run if the schedule is missed. Now it's set to wake my computer if the computer is asleep, but if my computer is turned off, it's not going to actually run. So what I would have to do is, or what it will do now is, as soon as I turn my computer on, it will say, oh, I've missed a schedule, I'm going to run it now. If it tries to run it and it fails, I've set it to actually try and rerun it every 1 hour. And it's just going to do that 3 times, because if it keeps failing and it fails for 3 times consecutively, which will effectively be 4 times, I'm going to say let's give up for today. Stop the task if it runs for longer than an hour. It should only take a minute or a couple of minutes. So if it's running for an hour, I don't want it to stay open. And that's all I changed in there. The history you'll see is disabled. That will be a history showing me how many events I've run. I don't have any that have run, that's why it's disabled. Now if you hit OK, it's going to ask you for your login password, your username and password, so that it can store it here. You do need to store your password if you're going to be saving the file in a location that you need to log in to have access to, like your OneDrive, as I'm doing here. Okay, so that's the third of the technologies, which is the task scheduler. If I open this file, it would run automatically, but let's actually close the file, and we'll close the website as well, and we'll have a look at the folder in which that is stored. So it's actually stored in my OneDrive, and it's in a folder called COVID, and you'll notice that there is just the Excel file, XLSM, because it's got macros on it. So there's just the Excel file in that folder. There are no CSV files in there yet. Now if I go to my task scheduler, so task scheduler, and I'm going to select that task from my library, so that one there, and I'm going to tell it to run that task now. So it should be running that task now, and you'll notice that it has actually opened Excel. You see I've got Excel open here, and it is running in the background. We can't see the task running, but after about 30 seconds of it running, what we will be able to do is go into this folder, and we will see that because the task has run, it will eventually put a CSV file in here with the data from today's date on the website that it has just got. So we can see in the background that that file has now closed down, and in our folder we now see today's data, or in fact that's yesterday's data, has been uploaded into this folder. Now each day that task will run automatically, and what will happen is we'll end up with more and more CSV files in here, one for each day, and because they have their own individual date component, you'll notice that one is the 10th, yet today is the 11th, so it's today's date minus 1. We'll end up with lots and lots of different files in there, and of course we could interrogate this entire folder using a separate Power Query to then aggregate or return the data there, or plot it on a graph or whatever we wanted, and of course we could filter it down to just the countries of interest that we were interested in. Within that data there is also the master data for the whole of grouped areas such as the whole world or North America or Europe. So it's more than just individual countries data within that file, and all of that could be cleaned and filtered out as required within the Power Query that looked at this entire folder. Now you may be saying, why am I doing this for COVID? Well, initially I wasn't. Initially I was asked to do it for pricing for oil prices, daily oil prices, and just recently, in fact a couple of days ago, I was asked to do it for a website that showed daily commodity prices for agricultural use, so for starches and things like that. So there's a couple of examples of where this might be useful, but of course I just used the COVID data as an example, and I hope it has been useful to at least somebody, and as always, thank you for listening.